The FIA makes big changes to the ADU system, Carlos is looking to switch teams soon, and Newey's future in F1 is in question. Let's get into the latest F1 news. The FIA just dropped a major announcement that could completely change how Formula One sounds, and honestly, the reaction from fans has been all over the place. We need to talk about this because there are some genuinely important details that most people are glossing over, and by the end of this video, you will understand exactly what is happening, why it matters, and what it means for the future of the sport. So here's the situation. The FIA has acknowledged that the current power unit regulations, specifically around the exhaust and combustion systems, need some tweaking. The audio experience inside the stadium and for viewers at home has been a point of frustration for a long time. Fans have been vocal about missing that raw, visceral sound that older Formula One cars used to produce, that screaming V8 or V10 note that you felt in your chest rather than just heard with your ears. The current hybrid turbo power units simply do not produce that same sensation, and the FIA is now officially responding to that criticism. But here is where it gets interesting, and this is the part most coverage is completely missing. This is not just about making the cars louder for the sake of it. There is a much deeper engineering and regulatory conversation happening underneath the surface, and understanding that context is what separates the people who truly get Formula One from the casual observers who see the headlines and move on. The FIA has been working with teams and engine manufacturers on what they are calling refinements to the existing framework. These are targeted adjustments rather than wholesale revolutionary changes. The governing body is trying to thread a very specific needle here. They want to improve the acoustic experience for fans attending races and watching on television without compromising the hybrid efficiency targets that the sport committed to when these regulations were introduced. That commitment to sustainability and road relevance is not going anywhere. It is actually a cornerstone of why the manufacturers are involved in the sport at all. Ferrari, Mercedes, Honda, and Renault are all developing technology in Formula One that feeds directly into their road car programs. So you cannot simply rip out the hybrid systems and go back to screaming naturally aspirated engines. The economics and the politics of the sport simply do not allow for that. What the FIA is exploring is whether specific exhaust routing changes or adjustments to how the turbo interacts with the overall exhaust system could unlock more of that characteristic sound without killing efficiency. This is genuinely fascinating engineering territory because the turbocharger itself is one of the primary reasons current power units sound the way they do. The turbo essentially acts as a muffler for a large portion of the combustion noise. The exhaust gases hit the turbine blades before they exit the car, which scrubs a significant amount of the acoustic energy that you would otherwise hear. If you can modify how and where those gases exit after passing through the turbo, you potentially change the character of the sound profile quite dramatically. Now, some of you are probably thinking, well, why has this taken so long? These regulations have been in place for over a decade at this point, and that is a completely fair question. The honest answer is that the FIA has been balancing a lot of competing priorities simultaneously. Cost caps, new team entries, the ongoing commercial negotiations, the broadcast deals, the sprint race format debates, and the long-term regulatory planning for what comes after the current engine formula. Sound quality has always been on the list, but it has never been at the absolute top of that list until recently. The fan sentiment data and the attendance and viewership metrics appear to have finally moved this issue up the priority ladder in a meaningful way. There is also a psychological dimension to this conversation that rarely gets discussed. Sound is not just about entertainment. It is about the emotional connection between a spectator and the sport. When you are standing trackside and a car passes you at full throttle, the sound is a massive part of what makes that experience feel significant and dangerous and alive. It triggers a physiological response. Your heart rate changes, your adrenaline spikes. That sensory experience is what turns a casual fan into a lifelong devotee of the sport. Circuits that once sold out purely on the reputation of the sound and spectacle are now having to work harder to justify the ticket price. That is not a coincidence, and the FIA understands this better than they are perhaps publicly willing to admit. The proposed tweaks are expected to go through the normal technical working group process, which means teams will have input, the engine manufacturers will have input, and nothing will happen overnight. Realistically, if these changes get approved, you are probably looking at implementation over the next regulatory cycle, rather than something that appears on the grid tomorrow. The FIA tends to move cautiously on technical regulation changes, and with good reason. History has shown that even small specification changes can create massive competitive imbalances if they are not carefully managed and given sufficient lead time for all parties to adapt. What is genuinely encouraging here is the tone of the FIA communication. Rather than dismissing the concerns or pointing to performance data and saying everything is fine, there seems to be a genuine acknowledgement that the spectator experience needs attention. That is a healthier institutional posture than we have seen in some previous governance eras, where criticism from outside the paddock was treated with something closer to contempt. The new leadership appears to be taking a more holistic view of what Formula One is, meaning not just a technical competition, but a global entertainment product that lives or dies on emotional engagement. Let me put some perspective on the scale of this challenge though, because I do not want this video to read as unrealistically optimistic. Engineering a better sound out of the current power unit architecture is genuinely difficult. The teams and manufacturers have spent billions of dollars optimizing these engines for performance and efficiency. Every component exists for a reason, and changing exhaust routing or turbine configurations has knock-on effects for packaging, cooling, weight distribution, and reliability. None of those consequences are trivial, especially under a cost cap environment where every development dollar has to be justified. So while the FIA wants improvements, the teams are going to push back hard on anything that creates significant re-engineering costs or competitive disruption. There is also the question of whether sound improvements alone are enough to address the broader spectator experience challenge. Some analysts argue that the racing itself, the strategic elements and the DRS passes, and the tire degradation games have arguably become more watchable during the hybrid era, even if the raw sensory experience has diminished. The actual on-track competition has been compelling, particularly in recent seasons. But other voices in the paddock believe that the emotional baseline of the sport, the fundamental visceral appeal that drew people to it in the first place, has been quietly eroding, and you cannot measure that kind of cultural erosion on a lap time chart. What the FIA is attempting here is a kind of restoration project. They are trying to recover something that was lost without dismantling what was gained. It is a delicate operation, and it will require genuine collaboration between the governing body, the teams, the manufacturers, and the commercial rights holder. All of those parties have slightly different interests, which means the negotiation is complex even when everyone broadly agrees on the direction. The teams that are performing well under the current regulations have less incentive to disrupt the technical status quo. The manufacturers that have built strong hybrid programs want to protect the competitive advantages baked into their architectures, and the circuits that have invested heavily in fan facilities want the payoff in terms of atmosphere and attendance. Threading all of those interests into a coherent regulatory change that satisfies everyone is genuinely hard work. So where does this leave us? The FIA has taken an important first step by publicly acknowledging that tweaks are needed. The credibility of that acknowledgement now depends entirely on what follows. If this leads to a rigorous technical process with genuine outcomes that fans can experience at the trackside within a reasonable time frame, then this announcement represents meaningful progress. If it becomes another item that cycles through working groups for years without resolution, then the frustration in the fan base will deepen. My honest take is that the sport is at a genuinely interesting inflection point right now. The commercial success of Formula One globally has never been stronger. Attendance is up in many markets. The American expansion has been remarkable. But underneath that commercial success, there are questions about the soul of the product, and the sound debate is one of the most tangible expressions of those deeper questions. The FIA knows this, the teams know this, the manufacturers know this. The question is whether the politics and the economics will allow them to do what the fans are clearly asking for. Keep watching this space because the decisions made in the next 18 months are going to shape what Formula One sounds like, looks like, and feels like for the next decade. If you found this breakdown useful, subscribe because we will be covering every development on this story as it evolves. What if I told you that one driver's interest in a team is being treated as literal proof that the entire project is legitimate? That's not a rumor. That's exactly what Mattia Binotto said publicly about Carlos Sainz and the Audi Formula One program, and the more you sit with that statement, the more fascinating it becomes. Because what Binotto is essentially admitting is that even a manufacturer with the resources of Audi needed external validation from a top-tier driver just to feel confident about their own future in the sport. That tells you everything about where this project actually stands and why the next 12 months are going to be absolutely critical for everyone involved. Now, most people look at this story and just see another driver linked to another team. Sainz gets connected to a new seat, everyone speculates for a week, and then the cycle moves on. But that surface-level reading completely misses what's actually happening here. This is a story about credibility, about whether a brand new Formula One entry can convince the paddock that it deserves to be taken seriously, and about one of the most strategically underrated drivers on the grid potentially becoming the face of that transformation. Stick around because we are going to break this down from every angle, and by the end you are going to see this situation in a completely different light. Here is the roadmap. First, we are going to talk about why Sainz's interest matters so much more than the headline suggests. Then we are going to dig into what Binotto is actually building at Audi and why the validation angle is a double-edged sword. And finally, we are going to look at what this means for the bigger picture of Formula One's competitive landscape heading into the back half of this decade. So let's start with Carlos Sainz himself, because there is a common mistake people make when analyzing his career moves. They treat him as a reactive player, someone who gets displaced and then scrambles to find a landing spot. That framing is completely wrong. Sainz has consistently made calculated decisions at key inflection points, and when a driver of his caliber and experience starts showing genuine interest in a project, it is not because he ran out of better options. It is because he sees something other people are not seeing yet. Think about what Sainz brings to the table from a team-building perspective. He is not just fast, he is an incredibly structured communicator who can translate what a car is doing into actionable engineering feedback. He has worked at multiple teams through very different phases of development. He knows what a project looks like when it is going somewhere, and he knows what one looks like when it is going nowhere. So when Mattia Binotto tells the world that Sainz's interest validates the Audi project, he is not just being diplomatic. He is acknowledging that a man who has seen Formula One from the inside out, who has no reason to take a career gamble without serious due diligence, looked at what they are building in Hinwil and decided it was worth his time. That is meaningful signal in a paddock where everyone is watching everyone else for signs of who to trust. And here is what most analysts are glossing over. The validation does not just go one way. Yes, Sainz's interest tells the market that Audi might be the real deal. But Audi's seriousness also says something about where Sainz sees his own trajectory. He is not chasing a nostalgia trip. He is looking for a project where he can be the anchor, the reference point, the driver around whom an entire competitive philosophy gets built. That is a completely different kind of ambition than just collecting race wins for an already established operation. Now let's talk about Binotto and what he is actually constructing here, because this is where the double-edged sword comes in. When you frame a driver's interest as validation for your project, you are doing something strategically clever, but you are also making an implicit admission. You are telling the world that the project needed validating. And in Formula One, perception is infrastructure. The moment people start doubting whether a manufacturer is truly committed, you start losing the engineers, the suppliers, the sponsorship conversations, and eventually the drivers who were on the fence. Binotto knows this game intimately. He ran Ferrari for years. He understands that narrative management is as important as technical execution. So by putting Sainz's interest front and center in public statements, Binotto is doing something very deliberate. He is using one man's reputation as a credibility anchor for an entire organization. Every time a headline says Sainz is considering Audi, it implicitly communicates that Audi is worth considering. It is a feedback loop that benefits both parties, and it is being orchestrated with a level of media sophistication that suggests the Audi leadership team has learned from some painful lessons about how Formula One projects can collapse under the weight of public skepticism before they even get to the grid. The context here matters enormously. Audi officially entered the Formula One landscape through their acquisition of the Sauber team, which is the same Hinwil-based operation now rebranding toward the Audi identity. The timeline is tight, the pressure to show progress is real, and the most visible way to demonstrate momentum is not lap times, because those are months or years away. The most visible way is driver acquisition. Landing a name like Sainz would send a signal through the entire paddock that this project is ready to compete for genuine talent, not just grateful backmarkers looking for any seat. But here is the tension that sits underneath all of this. Sainz has options. He is not without alternatives in the current market, and Audi knows that every week they cannot show concrete progress, whether that means lap time improvements, technical hires, or clear infrastructure milestones, is a week where another offer somewhere else becomes relatively more attractive. This is the pacing challenge Binotto is managing in real time, and the Sainz validation story is part of how he buys himself credibility with the internal Audi stakeholders who want to see external proof that the Formula One investment is landing with the right people. What does all of this mean for the bigger picture? Formula One is in a fascinating structural moment right now. The grid is competitive, the regulations are tight enough that new entrants face an enormous catch-up challenge, but the commercial opportunity is larger than it has ever been. New manufacturers do not get many chances to enter cleanly, and the ones who do have to move fast to establish themselves before the competitive window shifts again. Audi's ability to attract a driver of Sainz's standing would immediately change the conversation about what they are capable of achieving in their opening seasons. Think about what it communicates to the engineers Audi is still trying to recruit. Think about what it says to the commercial partners looking for reasons to invest. Think about the message it sends to rival teams who are quietly watching whether Audi's project firms up or slowly loses momentum. A single driver signing does not guarantee results, but it fundamentally changes the psychology of everyone surrounding the team. It creates belief, and in motorsport, belief is a performance variable that rarely shows up in the data, but absolutely shows up in the results. There is something almost poetic about the fact that Carlos Sainz, a driver whose entire career has been built on proving his worth in difficult circumstances, might now serve as the proof point for an entire manufacturer's Formula One credibility. Two entities, each needing the other to confirm something about themselves, circling toward a partnership that could reshape the back half of this decade in ways we are only just beginning to map out. And if you want to understand where the story goes next, if you want to see the next layer of what is building in Formula One right now, there is a video sitting right there that breaks down exactly what the current driver market looks like and which moves are going to define the next chapter of this sport. What if I told you that two of the biggest stories in Formula One right now could completely reshape the entire championship landscape before a single lap of next season is even run? And I'm not talking about driver contracts or team politics. I'm talking about something far more fundamental. The technical genius that was supposed to rescue one team from mediocrity, and a secret weapon hidden inside an engine that could determine whether a brand new American team sinks or swims the moment they hit the grid. Stick with me, because by the end of this video, you are going to see Formula One in a completely different way. Let's start with Adrian Newey and Aston Martin, because the story of how this partnership is playing out is honestly one of the most fascinating sagas in modern Formula One, and the cracks are starting to show in ways that nobody predicted. Cast your mind back to when the announcement was made. Adrian Newey, the most celebrated aerodynamicist in the history of the sport, the man whose fingerprints are on championship after championship, was leaving Red Bull and heading to Aston Martin. The reaction was electric. Aston Martin, a team backed by the enormous resources of Lawrence Stroll, suddenly felt like a genuine title contender in waiting. The logic was simple. Take one of the wealthiest team owners in the paddock, add one of the most brilliant technical minds the sport has ever seen, and what do you get? A recipe for dominance, right? Well, not quite. And this is where it gets really interesting. Johnny Herbert, the former Formula One driver and pundit who has never been accused of mincing his words, has come out and said something that a lot of people in the paddock are privately thinking but publicly avoiding. His assessment of the Newey situation at Aston Martin is genuinely alarming if you are a fan of the Silverstone-based outfit, and the core of his argument centers on timing, expectations, and the brutal reality of how Formula One development cycles actually work. Here is the thing about Adrian Newey that sometimes gets lost in the conversation. The man is undeniably a genius. Nobody is questioning that. His track record speaks for itself in a way that very few people in any sport can match. But Herbert's concern is not about Newey's ability. It never was. The concern is about what Newey is actually walking into, and whether the conditions at Aston Martin are set up to allow that genius to flourish in the time frame that everybody is expecting. Think about it from a practical standpoint. When Newey was at Red Bull, he was operating within a machine that had been refined over years. The infrastructure, the team dynamics, the culture, the processes, everything around him was built to support and amplify his vision. He was not rebuilding from scratch. He was the creative force sitting at the top of an already elite technical operation. Aston Martin is a different story entirely. Yes, they have spent enormous sums of money. Yes, the facilities at Silverstone are genuinely impressive and getting better all the time. But facilities and financial investment are not the same thing as institutional knowledge and deeply embedded technical culture. Those things take years to develop, not months. You cannot simply throw money at a building and expect the accumulated wisdom of decades to materialize overnight. Herbert's point, and it is a sharp one, is that the timeline people are expecting from this partnership may simply be unrealistic. The idea that Newey arrives, waves some kind of aerodynamic magic wand, and suddenly Aston Martin is fighting at the front of the grid within a season or two is, according to Herbert, a dangerous oversimplification of how this works. And when you look at the actual performance trajectory of Aston Martin over recent seasons, the numbers support that concern. There was a period not long ago where Aston Martin looked like they were genuinely on an upward curve. Fernando Alonso was extracting extraordinary results from machinery that was not necessarily the fastest car on the grid, but was competitive enough to earn podiums and points hauls that had the team buzzing. But that momentum has stuttered, the development curve has flattened, other teams have caught up and in some cases overtaken them, and the fundamental question that hangs over everything is whether Newey's arrival fundamentally changes that trajectory or merely adds prestige to a team that is still trying to solve deep structural challenges. There is also the human element here, which is something that gets underplayed in these conversations. Adrian Newey is not a young man building his legacy anymore. He is an extraordinarily accomplished individual who has the freedom to be selective about what he does and how he does it. His working methods, his approach to design, his philosophy around aerodynamics, these things have been shaped over decades at Red Bull. Integrating that into a completely different environment with different people, different processes, and different expectations is not a frictionless transition. It takes time. It requires adjustment on both sides, and time is precisely what teams in the middle of the competitive grid cannot afford to waste. Herbert's broader point seems to be that Aston Martin may have sold a dream to themselves and to their fan base that reality is going to struggle to deliver on schedule. That is not an indictment of Newey or of the team. It is just an honest acknowledgement that genius requires the right environment to produce results, and building that environment is the hardest part of the whole equation. Now here is where the story gets even more layered. Because while Aston Martin is navigating the challenge of integrating Newey and hoping that the investment eventually pays off, there is a parallel question about what this means for the competitive order of Formula One more broadly. Every team on the grid is watching. They know that if Aston Martin eventually gets this right, they become a genuinely dangerous force. The Stroll money is real. The Newey mind is real. The facilities are real. The potential is absolutely real. But potential and results are separated by a gap that has humbled many teams in this sport before. The question that nobody can answer definitively right now is how wide that gap is, and how long it will take to close. Herbert seems to think the answer is longer than most people want to admit. And given his experience in the sport, both as a competitor and as an analyst, that perspective deserves to be taken seriously rather than dismissed. Let's pause here for a second, because there is something important I want you to hold in your mind as we move into the second part of this video. The Newey story and the story we are about to discuss are actually connected by a single thread, and that thread is this. In Formula One, the gap between having the right pieces and having those pieces working together effectively is enormous. Whether we are talking about a legendary designer joining a new team or a new team trying to secure a competitive power unit, the principle is the same. Resources and talent are necessary but not sufficient. The execution is everything. And on that note, let us talk about Ferrari, Cadillac, and what might be the most technically fascinating subplot of the entire next chapter of Formula One, Cadillac F1. The name alone carries a certain electricity, does it not? An American team in Formula One, racing under one of the most iconic automotive brands in the world, entering the sport just as Formula One is experiencing unprecedented popularity in the United States. The stars seem aligned, the narrative writes itself. But as Marcin Budkowski has pointed out, and Budkowski is someone who knows the inner workings of this sport at a deeply technical level given his background, there is a crucial element sitting underneath all that glamour and excitement that could determine whether Cadillac is a genuine competitor or an expensive also-ran from day one. That element is the power unit, specifically the Ferrari power unit that Cadillac is set to use as a customer team. Now, before we get into the specifics, let me just set the scene for why this matters so much. In the modern era of Formula One, the power unit is not just an engine. It is not just a box that makes the car go fast. It is an enormously complex hybrid system involving an internal combustion engine, an energy recovery system harvesting power from the brakes, another energy recovery system harvesting power from the turbocharger, and a battery that stores and deploys all of that harvested energy. The interaction between all of these components and the software that manages their deployment is so complex and so sensitive that the difference between a well-optimized unit and a slightly less optimized unit can be several tenths of a second per lap. In Formula One terms, that is a chasm. Here is what makes the Ferrari situation particularly interesting, and this is where Budkowski's insight becomes genuinely crucial. Ferrari has developed certain characteristics, certain nuances, certain advantages within their power unit architecture that do not automatically transfer when they supply that unit to a customer team. The way Ferrari themselves deploy the power unit, the specific strategies they use, the particular optimizations they have developed over years of running their own car around their power unit, these things represent a significant competitive edge. And the question is, how much of that edge does Cadillac actually get access to? This is not a simple question with a simple answer. Customer teams in Formula One have always faced this dynamic. When you buy an engine from a manufacturer, you are not buying the entire integrated knowledge system that the manufacturer has built around that engine. You are buying a unit, and there is always a gap, sometimes small and sometimes substantial, between what the works team extracts from that power unit and what the customer team is able to achieve. But here is where it gets even more nuanced. The regulations around power units, and specifically around what manufacturers can and cannot differentiate between their works team and their customer teams, create a fascinating gray area. Ferrari has reportedly developed certain characteristics within their power unit that are technically available to customers in terms of the hardware itself, but the real question is about the software, the strategies, and the accumulated data that Ferrari has gathered from running their own car. That knowledge base is not something you can simply hand over in a box. Budkowski's point, drawing on his deep understanding of how teams operate technically, is that Cadillac entering Formula One with a Ferrari customer power unit is genuinely exciting and gives them a foundation that is far better than trying to develop their own unit from scratch. But the expectation that this automatically places them anywhere near the Ferrari Works team in terms of raw power unit performance would be misguided. The hardware might be largely the same, or at least very similar. The accumulated wisdom around how to extract maximum performance from that hardware is emphatically not the same. And this matters enormously for how we should calibrate our expectations for Cadillac's debut season. There is a real and understandable temptation, particularly given the excitement surrounding the team's entry into the sport and the enormous resources they have available, to project a trajectory that assumes the power unit question is essentially solved. Ferrari engine sorted. Now let's talk about the chassis, the aerodynamics, the strategy. But Budkowski's analysis suggests that treating the power unit situation as a solved problem is a mistake. It is an ongoing challenge that will require significant work from Cadillac's technical staff to understand and optimize around. Think about the journey that, say, Haas went through when they entered Formula One. Haas also came in as a Ferrari customer team and benefited enormously from that relationship, but their trajectory was never a straight line upward. There were seasons where the relationship between the car's aerodynamic characteristics and the power unit's delivery created challenges that took considerable time to understand and address. And Haas had the benefit of entering the sport at a time when the competitive field was, in some ways, more forgiving than it is today. The midfield is extraordinarily tight now. The margins are razor thin. Cadillac are entering into one of the most competitive eras in the sport's history. Now let's connect this back to what makes this dynamic so fascinating from a strategic perspective. Ferrari supplying Cadillac with a power unit is not purely an altruistic or commercial arrangement. There is a competitive dimension to consider as well. Ferrari, like any works team, has a vested interest in their customer teams being good enough to participate meaningfully in the championship without being so good that they become genuine threats to the works operation. This is the eternal tension in customer-team relationships. You want your engine customer to perform well enough to validate the performance of your power unit. You do not want them to be so well set up that they start beating you on track. The mechanisms through which this tension plays out are subtle. It is rarely about deliberately handicapping a customer. That would be against the regulations and would be commercially disastrous if it ever came to light. But it plays out through the natural dynamics of information sharing, software update timing, development prioritization, and the depth of technical collaboration between the manufacturer and the customer team. Ferrari will always, by necessity, prioritize their own development program. Cadillac will receive updates and support, but on a timeline that serves Ferrari's interests first. This is not a criticism of Ferrari. This is just the reality of how the business works. Every works team operates this way. Mercedes does it with their customers. Honda did it during their various supply arrangements. It is baked into the structure of how power unit supply works in Formula One. What this means for Cadillac practically is that their technical leadership will need to be exceptionally smart about how they build their car around the power unit they have, how they develop their understanding of its characteristics over time, and how they manage the relationship with Ferrari to extract as much knowledge transfer as possible. These are not insurmountable challenges. They are absolutely manageable for a well-resourced, well-led team, but they are real challenges. And Budkowski's insight is valuable precisely because it strips away the marketing narrative and focuses on the technical substance. Here is something else worth considering that ties both of these stories together in a way that I find genuinely compelling. Both Aston Martin with Newey and Cadillac with their Ferrari power unit are fundamentally stories about the difference between acquiring an asset and deploying that asset effectively. Aston Martin have acquired what might be the most brilliant aerodynamicist in the history of the sport. Cadillac have acquired access to what is currently one of the strongest power unit packages on the grid. In both cases, the acquisition itself is genuinely impressive and gives each team a foundation that most teams would envy. But as we have explored, Acquisition and effective deployment are very different things. The gap between having Newey and building a championship-winning car around Newey's vision is real and substantial. The gap between having a Ferrari power unit and extracting the same performance from it that Ferrari's works team does is equally real and substantial. And in both cases, the teams involved are going to have to do enormous amounts of work to bridge those gaps. This is, in many ways, the central challenge of Formula One as a sport. The regulations are designed to be equitable in various ways, but the accumulated advantages of the most successful teams manifest in exactly these kinds of subtle, hard-to-quantify ways. It is not just about money, though money obviously matters enormously. It is about knowledge, experience, and institutional capability. These things are genuinely difficult to replicate quickly, regardless of how much you spend. And this is why both of these stories are worth paying extremely close attention to over the next couple of seasons. Because the ways in which Aston Martin and Cadillac navigate these challenges will tell us a huge amount about whether the competitive order of Formula One is capable of being genuinely disrupted, or whether the established teams have structural advantages that are essentially insurmountable in the short term. Let me give you a specific scenario to think about. Imagine it is 18 months from now. Aston Martin have had another season where the results have been solid, but not spectacular. Newey's influence is beginning to be felt in certain areas of the car's development, but the full expression of his vision is still 18 months to 2 years away from being translated into competitive hardware. Herbert's warnings are looking prescient. The team is maintaining patience. Lawrence Stroll is backing the long game, but the media narrative is starting to become impatient and demanding. Meanwhile, Cadillac have completed their first season. They have had moments of genuine pace that surprised people, particularly at circuits where power unit characteristics were less decisive and aerodynamic efficiency mattered more. But they have also had races where the gap to the front of the midfield felt uncomfortable, and where the nuances of deploying their Ferrari power unit to maximum effect clearly cost them positions and points. Budkowski's analysis is proven correct in the most practical way possible, through lap times. In that scenario, what do both teams do? How do they respond? And what does it tell us about the sport's future? That is the question that is worth sitting with. For Aston Martin, the path forward is clear, even if it is not easy. They have to trust the process. Newey needs time, integration, and the right supporting cast to build around his vision. The team needs to resist the temptation to make reactive changes driven by short-term results, because reactive changes and stable long-term development are incompatible goals. Lawrence Stroll has shown a willingness to spend money at a level that very few team owners in the history of the sport have matched. Whether he has the patience to match that financial commitment with strategic patience is the real question. For Cadillac, the path is similarly clear but differently challenging. They need to invest heavily in their understanding of the Ferrari power unit, develop a deep and productive working relationship with the Maranello technical team, and ensure that their own aerodynamic and chassis development is sophisticated enough to compensate for any performance gaps in power unit deployment. They also need to recognize that their first season is fundamentally a learning exercise, regardless of what the public expectations might be. The teams that have entered Formula One and succeeded over the medium term have consistently been the ones that treated their early seasons as foundation building rather than competitive benchmarking. Now I want to zoom out for a moment because I think there is a bigger picture here that both of these stories illuminate. Formula One in 2026 is at a genuinely fascinating inflection point. The sport has never been more globally popular. The commercial success is extraordinary. The investment flowing into the sport from new teams, new sponsors, new broadcasters, and new markets is at levels that would have seemed impossible a decade ago. And yet, for all of that growth and excitement, the fundamental competitive structure of the sport, the question of which teams actually challenge for wins and championships, remains remarkably stable. Mercedes, Ferrari, and Red Bull have dominated the competitive landscape for so long that even when one of them goes through a relatively weak period, the expectation is always that they will find their way back. And they always do, because the structural advantages they have accumulated over years of competitive racing are so deeply embedded that they persist even through difficult development cycles. The question that Aston Martin with Newey and Cadillac with their Ferrari power unit both represent, in their very different ways, is whether those structural advantages can be meaningfully challenged. Herbert's concern about Newey and Aston Martin is, at its core, a concern about whether structural advantages can be acquired quickly enough to matter. The answer history suggests is usually no, at least not on the timeline that fans and media want. But history also occasionally produces exceptions. Red Bull themselves were not always a dominant force. They went from also-rans to the most dominant team in the sport's history within a relatively compressed time frame. That transformation required exceptional people, enormous resources, and yes, the right structural conditions. If Aston Martin can create those conditions around Newey, the outcome could be extraordinary. Herbert is simply cautioning that creating those conditions is much harder than announcing the signing. Budkowski's concern about Cadillac and the Ferrari power unit nuances is, at its core, a concern about the depth of technical knowledge that cannot simply be purchased. You can buy hardware. You cannot buy the accumulated insight that comes from years of developing and optimizing around that hardware. The gap between customer teams and works teams in terms of power unit performance is real and persistent in Formula One, and there is no shortcut that bypasses the need to do the developmental work to close it. Both concerns, Herbert's about Newey and Budkowski's about the power unit situation, are expressions of the same fundamental truth about this sport. Formula One rewards depth, patience, and relentless detail-focused development above almost everything else. Talent and resources are the price of entry. They do not by themselves guarantee success, but here is what I want to leave you with, because I do not want this to feel like a purely pessimistic take on either story. The fact that these challenges are real does not mean that Aston Martin and Cadillac are doomed to struggle indefinitely. Quite the opposite, actually. The most exciting thing about Formula One right now is precisely that there are teams with genuine resources, genuine talent, and genuine ambition trying to break the established order. Whether they succeed in the next season or the season after that is almost beside the point. The attempt itself, the genuine competitive pressure they create, makes the entire field better and the sport more unpredictable. Aston Martin with Newey represents a long-term bet on genius being able to reshape an organization's technical DNA. If it works, the payoff could be extraordinary. The timeline might be longer than the hype suggests, and Herbert is right to flag that, but the potential upside is genuinely championship level if the right conditions are created. Cadillac with a Ferrari power unit represents something equally interesting. A new team with American ambition and resources trying to establish themselves in the most technically demanding motorsport championship in existence. The power unit nuances that Budkowski highlights are real obstacles, but they are navigable obstacles for a team with the right technical leadership and the right approach to building knowledge over time. Both stories are fundamentally stories about potential colliding with reality, and in Formula One, those collisions are exactly what generate the most compelling narratives over the course of a season or a cycle of seasons. The teams that understand the gap between potential and performance, that approach the challenge with clear eyes rather than marketing language, are the teams that eventually close that gap. The teams that believe the press releases are the teams that get surprised when reality arrives at the factory door. So what should you take from all of this? If you are an Aston Martin fan, temper your expectations for the next 12 months while keeping your belief in the long-term project. The Newey partnership is genuinely exciting, but Herbert's caution is grounded in experience and deserves to be heard. The process will take time, and that is okay. If you are excited about Cadillac entering Formula One, as well you should be, because the American angle brings genuinely compelling energy to the sport, just go in with a realistic appreciation of what Budkowski is highlighting about the power unit situation. The Ferrari supply is a strong foundation. It is not a guarantee of immediate competitiveness at the level the hype might suggest. And if you are just a Formula One fan who loves the sport, Both of these stories are reasons to be genuinely excited about the next 2 or 3 seasons. Because the ingredients are there, the talent is there, the money is there, the ambition is absolutely there. What remains to be seen is whether the execution matches the potential, and watching that unfold in real time, with all the uncertainty and drama that goes with it, is exactly why this sport is so addictive. The gap between the dream and the result is where Formula One lives. It always has been, and right now, with Newey at Aston Martin and Cadillac preparing to take on the establishment with Ferrari power, that gap has never looked more interesting to watch closing. If you made it this far, drop a comment below and tell me honestly, do you think Herbert is right about the Newey timeline? And how long do you think it takes Cadillac to genuinely challenge the established midfield? I want to hear your takes because this community consistently has some of the most knowledgeable Formula One opinions on YouTube, and I read every single one. Hit the subscribe button if you have not already, because this channel covers exactly these kinds of deep dives into the stories that matter behind the headlines. And if you want more, the video sitting right over there goes even deeper into how customer team power unit arrangements have shaped the competitive landscape of Formula One over the past decade. Trust me, you are going to want to watch that one next.